Neil Entwistle. On January 20th, 2006, police rushed to a quiet home in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. Inside, they found 27-year-old Rachel Entwistle and her infant daughter shot dead. The family had moved from the UK only months earlier. Neil Entwistle, Rachel's husband, told police he discovered their bodies after returning home. First responders quickly determined the deaths were homicides. Rachel had been shot multiple times. Lillian had been shot once while in her crib. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The scene suggested the violence came from someone inside the home. Investigators immediately focused on Neil. Gunshot residue was found on his clothing. He could not explain how it got there. Police recovered a .22 caliber pistol from the house. The firearm was registered to Neil. Ballistics testing later confirmed it was used in the killings. From the start, his explanation did not fit the evidence. Neil told police he had left early that morning to run errands. He said the family was alive when he left. When he returned, they were dead. Investigators examined his timeline closely. Small details changed when questioned. Witnesses described the marriage as strained, especially around money. Neil struggled to maintain steady employment. Financial stress appeared constant. Within days of the murders, Neil left the country. He flew back to England without attending funerals. He did not remain available to investigators. Authorities viewed the departure as a major red flag. An arrest warrant was issued. Neil Entwistle was taken into custody in the United Kingdom. He was extradited to Massachusetts to stand trial. Digital evidence became a central part of the case. Investigators seized Neil's computer. They analyzed his internet search history. What they found was deeply troubling. In the days leading up to the murders, Neil searched for information about firearms. He also searched for silencers and methods to make a murder look like a burglary. The searches were time-stamped and recent. They undermined any claim of coincidence. Investigators also reviewed financial records. They found unpaid bills and limited prospects. Witnesses reported Neil felt trapped by responsibility. Prosecutors later argued he believed his family was holding him back. They said the murders were a calculated attempt to start over. The absence of forced entry supported that theory. The trial began in 2007. The defense argued the evidence was circumstantial. They claimed gunshot residue could be transferred. They argued internet searches did not prove intent. They suggested the timeline left room for doubt. The prosecution focused on accumulation rather than a single fact. They presented the firearm, residue, digital searches, and behavior after the crime. Jurors heard how Rachel and Lillian were alive when Neil left the house. They were dead when he returned. They heard that the murder weapon belonged to him. They heard that he fled the country almost immediately. They heard about searches that pointed toward planning. The case did not rely on emotion. It relied on alignment. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Neil Entwistle was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was convicted for the deaths of both Rachel and Lillian. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no plea agreement and no expression of remorse. The case resonated on both sides of the Atlantic. A British citizen convicted in an American courtroom. A family erased in a single morning. Rachel's family was left with grief, compounded by distance. Her parents spoke of a daughter who trusted completely, a mother who believed she was building a secure future. Neil Entwistle maintained his innocence after conviction. Appeals were filed, but did not overturn the verdict. The evidence remained consistent across review. Rachel and Lillian's deaths were not attributed to chaos or impulse. They were treated as deliberate acts. This case did not hinge on mystery. It hinged on preparation and escape. Neil believed crossing an ocean would slow justice. Instead, it highlighted intent. Rachel trusted her husband in a new country. That trust proved fatal. The murders left no ambiguity about consequence. 2 lives ended so one man could avoid responsibility. Chris Watts. In August 2018, Colorado responded to a welfare check after a pregnant woman and her 2 daughters vanished from their home. On the morning of August 13th, Shanann Watts failed to answer calls or messages. She was 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant. Her daughters, Bella and Celeste, were also missing. A friend who had dropped Shanann off earlier that night raised the alarm. When officers arrived, the house appeared orderly. Shanann's car was still in the garage. Her purse, phone, and medication were inside. There was no note and no sign she had left voluntarily. Chris Watts told police his wife had taken the children and gone to a friend's house. He spoke calmly and cooperated with the welfare check. Body camera footage captured his behavior in real time. He avoided eye contact and offered vague explanations. He did not ask where officers planned to search. Friends immediately rejected his story. Shanann was deeply connected to her routine and her children. She never disappeared without contact. Investigators shifted quickly from search to scrutiny. They began reconstructing the final hours before Shanann went silent. Records showed she returned home from a business trip just before 2 a.m. By dawn, all communication stopped. Chris's movements that morning became a priority. He claimed he left early for work at an oil site. Investigators verified that timeline through company records and location data. The gap between his story and the physical evidence began to narrow. As detectives examined the marriage, a second life emerged. They uncovered financial problems, mounting debt, and emotional distance. More significantly, investigators learned Chris was involved in an affair. Witnesses reported he described his family as an obstacle to a new start. Messages showed him discussing a future without responsibility. The affair became central to understanding motive. Investigators believed he wanted to erase his current life rather than confront it. Forensic evidence inside the home was limited. There was no obvious sign of a violent struggle. However, the absence of evidence raised its own questions. Shanann and the children left behind everything they would have needed. Investigators noted this did not align with voluntary disappearance. Attention turned to Chris's worksite and his access that day. Search warrants were issued, and the focus tightened. Digital evidence accelerated the case dramatically. Phone data placed Chris at locations consistent with disposal sites. Surveillance cameras from neighbors captured movement near the home. Investigators compared timestamps to Chris's statements and found inconsistencies. During questioning, detectives used a measured approach. They allowed Chris to speak at length and correct himself. A polygraph test marked a turning point. His breathing changed, and his answers became unstable. Under pressure, Chris's narrative collapsed. He first claimed Shanann killed the children. Confronted with contradictions, he admitted the truth. He confessed to killing Shanann in their bedroom. He then admitted killing his daughters after leaving the house. He described transporting their bodies to an oil field. The confession provided locations investigators could verify. Search teams were sent to the site Chris identified. They recovered Shanann's body from a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were found where Chris said they would be. The recoveries confirmed the confession's accuracy. There was no remaining doubt about what had happened. The case transitioned fully into prosecution. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Body camera footage and interrogation videos spread worldwide. Viewers analyzed every word and expression. Many focused on how ordinary the setting had seemed. Investigators emphasized that the evidence spoke louder than demeanor. This was not an impulsive crime, driven by rage. It was driven by planning and avoidance. In November 2018, Chris Watts entered a guilty plea. He pleaded to multiple counts of first-degree murder. He also pleaded guilty to the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The plea spared the families a trial, but provided no explanation that satisfied. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The court also imposed additional years for related charges. Shanann's family spoke during sentencing. They described a woman devoted to her children and future. They spoke of trust that was misplaced. Friends revisited messages and videos that once felt joyful. The house was eventually sold. The neighborhood returned to routine. But the recordings remain. Chris Watts did not kill to escape danger. He killed to remove responsibility. He believed erasure was easier than honesty. The case stands as a reminder that violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears calm, rehearsed language. And sometimes the truth only surfaces because data refuses to stay silent. Scott Peterson. In December 2002, authorities in Modesto, California, responded to a missing pregnant woman report. On the afternoon of December 24th, Lacey Peterson was reported gone from her home. She was 30 years old and 8 months pregnant. Her husband said she had gone out for a walk and never returned. Officers arrived to a house that looked undisturbed. Lacey's dog was found wandering nearby with its leash still attached. Within hours, searchers spread through neighborhoods, parks, and canals. Detectives began with the last solid points on the timeline. Lacey had spoken with her mother earlier that day about Christmas plans. After that call, her movements became uncertain. Scott Peterson told investigators he left the house that morning to go fishing. He said he drove to the Berkeley Marina and spent time alone on the water. He returned home and claimed he noticed Lacey was missing. At first, his story sounded simple and possible. He agreed to interviews and answered questions without visible agitation. But relatives and friends noticed a detachment that did not match the situation. Search coordinators described him as focused on details, not desperation. Investigators also questioned why a solo fishing trip happened on Christmas Eve. They began verifying his route through receipts and records. As that work continued, detectives uncovered a critical issue in his personal life. Records and witness accounts indicated Scott had been involved in an affair. Investigators learned he had told the other woman he was not married. In later communications, he described this as his first holiday without a wife. Those statements, investigators noted, were made before Lacey disappeared. As the case intensified, the family's home became a center of public attention. Volunteers organized search parties and distributed flyers across the region. Police also watched Scott's behavior closely as media pressure grew. Witnesses reported seeing him tracking news coverage and visiting locations tied to the search. Detectives compared those observations to his documented movements and calls. The focus narrowed toward whether Scott's account could fit the known facts. Forensics and physical evidence were limited early on because Lacey was missing. Investigators instead built a picture from timelines, locations, and consistency. They examined Scott's boat use and the marina area he mentioned. They also looked at items in and around the home for signs of planning. Prosecutors later argued that concrete anchors made in Scott's garage mattered. Scott said the materials had ordinary household purposes. Investigators believed the anchors could have been used as weights. They also pointed to the geographical connection between Scott's trip and later discoveries. In April 2003, remains surfaced in the San Francisco Bay. Authorities identified the bodies as Lacey Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location was near the same waters, linked to Scott's reported fishing trip. The discovery shifted the investigation from a search to a homicide case. Forensic findings were described in broad, non-graphic terms in court filings. The central question became how Lacey and Connor ended up there and when. Investigators examined motive through relationships, pressure, and personal choices. Witnesses reported increasing strain in the marriage and concerns about commitment. Records indicated Scott had been presenting himself as free to start over. Prosecutors argued the pregnancy intensified the conflict between reality and his double life. They also highlighted deception as a pattern, not a single lie. To them, the affair was not just background, but a window into intent. Digital and documentary evidence helped test the timeline. Cell phone data placed Scott in areas consistent with his stated route. Prosecutors argued the same data also reinforced the marina connection. Investigators reviewed calls, travel logs, and the sequence of statements given publicly. They emphasized how small changes in wording appeared when details were challenged. In 2004, Scott Peterson went to trial. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence rather than a single direct proof. The defense argued there was reasonable doubt and alternative possibilities. The prosecution framed the evidence as a chain that held under scrutiny. Jurors heard about the affair, the timeline, and the Bay Discovery location. They weighed behavior, contradictions, and physical indicators presented in testimony. Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for Connor. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. While deception and a hidden double life shaped this case, the next story would show how a family can vanish behind a calm face, and how one confession can tear it open. Josh Powell. In December 2009, a disappearance in West Valley City, Utah quietly unfolded into a case that would never find easy answers. On the night of December 6, 2009, Susan Powell vanished from her home. She was 28 years old and the mother of 2 young boys. Her husband, Josh Powell, told police they had gone camping late at night. He claimed Susan never returned with him. The explanation immediately raised concern. Officers arrived to a house that appeared undisturbed. Susan's purse, wallet, phone, and shoes were still inside. Her car remained parked outside. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave. Friends described Susan as careful and methodical. She did not disappear without preparation or communication. The focus quickly turned to Josh. Investigators examined Josh's story closely. Camping in freezing temperatures with small children made little sense. Josh appeared emotionally flat during interviews. He cooperated selectively and avoided follow-up questions. There was no visible sign of a struggle inside the home. Without a body, the case stalled in its earliest stage. Josh was named a person of interest but never charged. As detectives dug deeper, a troubling history emerged. Susan had been keeping journals and recordings. In them, she documented fear and isolation. She wrote about Josh's controlling behavior. She described arguments, paranoia, and emotional abuse. In one recording, she stated that if she died, Josh should be investigated. Those words would later carry devastating weight. Josh Powell's own writings raised alarms. Police recovered thousands of pages from his computer. They included rants, plans, and disturbing fantasies. He wrote about life being easier without Susan. He referenced accidents and imagined outcomes. Still, imagination was not proof. Without remains, prosecutors could not move forward. Susan's parents refused to let the case fade. They spoke publicly and pressed authorities for action. They fought for custody of Susan's children. Over time, the court granted them supervised visitation only. Josh moved to Washington State with his sons. The case remained open, but inactive. Years passed with no arrest. Then on February 5, 2012, everything changed. Josh arrived at a rental house for a supervised visit with his children. A social worker waited outside. Moments after the boys entered, Josh locked the door. He attacked the children with a hatchet. He then ignited the house. Firefighters arrived but could not reach the victims in time. Josh Powell and both children died in the fire. The explosion ended any chance of a confession. It also forced authorities to speak more openly. Police stated publicly that they believed Josh had murdered Susan. They believed he disposed of her body during the 2009 camping trip. But Susan was never found. After Josh's death, investigators reviewed the case again. They acknowledged evidence that had long pointed in one direction. They cited his behavior, writings, and inconsistencies. They pointed to Susan's own warnings. Still, without remains, the case could not be prosecuted. The legal record remained incomplete. For Susan's parents, the loss was unbearable. They lost their daughter, then they lost their grandsons. They had tried to protect the children within the limits of the law. Those limits failed them. The system hesitated where certainty was demanded. The Powell case became a symbol of restraint. It showed how rules designed to protect the innocent can delay action. It demonstrated how suspicion alone is not enough for charges. Everyone involved sensed danger. No one could cross the legal threshold in time. Josh Powell did not act once. He waited. He watched the system slow itself. When pressure increased, he chose destruction over accountability. His final act ensured there would be no trial and no answers. Susan Powell's voice remains in her recordings. She documented fear clearly and deliberately. She left warnings meant to protect her children. Those warnings were not enough. Her body has never been recovered. Her case has never been tried. This story is not about mystery. It is about limits, about how evidence can accumulate without consequence. Susan Powell tried to tell the truth in advance. The truth arrived only after it was too late. Mark hacking. In July 2004, a missing person case in Salt Lake City, Utah began to unravel under a series of deceptive claims. On the morning of July 19, 2004, Lori Hacking did not show up for work. She was 27 years old, recently graduated and planning her future. Her husband, Mark Hacking, told police she had gone jogging and never returned. He said she left early and vanished without explanation. At first, police treated it as a routine missing persons case. Search teams were organized across the city. Flyers were distributed, and volunteers gathered for vigils. Mark remained visible during the early days. He gave interviews, thanked searchers, and appeared concerned. Friends described Lori as reliable and communicative. Her disappearance did not match her habits. Investigators began examining the details Mark had provided. Very quickly, inconsistencies surfaced. Police learned that Mark's personal history did not align with what he claimed. He had told Lori he was enrolled in medical school at the University of Utah. He said he was working toward a prestigious career. Investigators confirmed none of it was true. Mark had never attended medical school. He had fabricated transcripts and forged acceptance letters. The lies were not recent. They had been maintained for years. Investigators then learned something more troubling. Lori had discovered the truth days before she disappeared. Witnesses reported she confronted Mark about the deception. She threatened to expose the lies to family and friends. For Mark, that exposure meant total collapse. His identity, marriage, and future depended on the story he built. Police shifted their focus from search to suspicion. They searched the couple's apartment. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual, but forensic testing revealed traces of blood. The blood was later confirmed to belong to Lori. Investigators also recovered a rifle from the residence. Ballistics evidence suggested it had been fired recently. Mark's jogging story began to fall apart completely. Friends told investigators Lori never jogged alone. She disliked early mornings. She always told someone where she was going. No one recalled her planning a run that day. Investigators compared Mark's statements to physical evidence. Each comparison created more distance between his story and reality. The investigation reached a grim turning point days later. At a local landfill, police recovered plastic bags containing human remains. The remains were identified as Lori Hacking. The discovery ended hope and confirmed homicide. Mark was taken into custody shortly afterward. Under questioning, Mark confessed. He admitted Lori had confronted him about the lies. He said he panicked when faced with exposure. He told investigators he shot Lori while she slept. He then dismembered her body. He transported the remains to the landfill and discarded them. There was no claim of self-defense, no argument described as out of control, only fear of being revealed. Prosecutors described the killing as calculated and deliberate. They argued Mark murdered Lori to preserve a false identity, to avoid accountability, to maintain an image he could no longer support. The motive was not hatred, but desperation. Investigators emphasized how sustained deception can become a trap. When lies replace reality, exposure can feel unbearable. In 2005, Mark Hacking pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He waived his right to trial. The plea spared Lori's family from hearing graphic testimony. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed little emotion during sentencing. There was no explanation that softened the outcome. Laurie's family addressed the court. They described her as kind, honest, and driven. They spoke about trust that was betrayed completely. Friends replayed conversations where Mark's stories never quite add up, moments they ignored, signs they missed. This was not a crime of rage. It was a crime of exposure. Mark Hacking did not kill because he hated his wife. He killed because she knew the truth, because she threatened the image he had built his life around. The case left a lasting impact on the community. It highlighted how easily deception can hide in plain sight, how a convincing performance can delay suspicion, and how fear of consequences can turn inward and lethal. Laurie Hacking wanted honesty and a real future. Instead, she became evidence of a lie. A life erased to protect a false story that could never last. Michael Peterson. In December 2001, authorities in Durham, North Carolina, responded to a late-night emergency call, reporting a fall inside a private home. Just after midnight on December 9th, Kathleen Peterson was found at the bottom of a staircase. She was 48 years old, a successful business executive, and a mother. Her husband, Michael Peterson, told 911 operators she had fallen down the stairs. He said it was an accident. His voice was calm, almost distant, as he described the scene. First responders arrived to a startling amount of blood in the stairwell. Blood was visible on the walls, the floor, and the steps. Kathleen was unresponsive and pronounced dead at the scene. Despite the severity of the scene, there were no obvious skull fractures. Officers were immediately uncertain what they were dealing with. The home showed no signs of forced entry or burglary. Attention quickly turned inward, toward the people already inside. Investigators began reconstructing the evening. Michael said the couple had been drinking wine by the pool earlier. He claimed Kathleen went inside ahead of him. When he later entered the house, he said he found her injured at the stairs. That explanation raised questions as detectives examined the physical layout. They considered whether a fall alone could account for the blood patterns present. The medical examiner ruled Kathleen's death a homicide. The cause was listed as blunt force trauma to the head. Michael Peterson was charged with murder shortly afterward. Prosecutors believed Kathleen had been attacked and left to bleed. They argued the staircase was the crime scene, not the cause. The case moved quickly toward trial, built almost entirely on forensic interpretation. At the center of the prosecution's case was blood spatter evidence. An expert testified that the blood patterns suggested repeated blows. He stated the scene was inconsistent with a simple fall. According to this testimony, Kathleen's injuries aligned with an assault. The defense strongly disputed those conclusions. They argued the staircase was narrow and dangerous. They said a fall could be chaotic, violent, and visually misleading. The trial became a battle over science rather than motive alone. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered an earlier death. Years before, while living in Germany, Michael had been connected to another case. A family friend, Elizabeth Ratliff, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Michael had been the last known person to see her alive. German authorities had ruled that death an accident. Prosecutors introduced it to suggest a pattern. The defense called the connection unfair and prejudicial. Motive was also debated. Investigators learned Michael Peterson had been concealing aspects of his private life. Evidence showed he had exchanged explicit emails with other men. The prosecution argued Kathleen's discovery of this could have caused conflict. The defense countered that the marriage was stable and supportive. Friends offered differing views, leaving jurors to interpret credibility. In 2003, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Michael Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Kathleen's family, the verdict brought certainty. For Michael's supporters, it raised new doubts. The case did not fade quietly after sentencing. Over time, serious concerns emerged about the forensic evidence. The blood spatter expert who testified became controversial. His work in other cases was challenged and criticized. Courts began questioning whether his methods were reliable. Michael's defense team filed appeals based on this information. They argued the jury relied on flawed science. Years passed as the legal process slowly revisited the case. Public interest grew alongside the appeals. The case became the subject of extensive media coverage. A documentary series allowed viewers to watch real footage unfold. The public debate intensified. Some believed Michael was guilty and manipulative. Others believed the conviction rested on unstable ground. The staircase itself became a symbol of uncertainty. In 2011, a judge granted Michael Peterson a new trial. The ruling cited issues related to expert testimony and fairness. The state maintained its position that Kathleen had been murdered. Rather than face another full trial, Michael chose a different path. In 2017, he entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. He maintained his innocence while acknowledging the prosecution could likely convict. He was released from prison with time served. Legally, the case reached its end. Emotionally, it never did. Kathleen's family believes she was killed. Michael continues to say she fell. There is no confession and no definitive reconstruction that satisfies everyone. The staircase remains central to every version of the story. The case forces difficult questions. What happens when science is uncertain, when experts disagree, when truth depends on interpretation? Michael Peterson walks free, but the shadow of conviction remains. Kathleen Peterson is gone, her death debated rather than resolved, and the line between accident and violence remains for many unresolved. Robert Blake. In May 2001, police in Studio City, Los Angeles were called to investigate a shooting inside a parked vehicle on a residential street. On the night of May 4, 2001, Bonnie Lee Backley was found shot to death in the passenger seat of her husband's vehicle. She was 44 years old. Emergency responders pronounced her dead at the scene. Her husband, actor Robert Blake, told police the shooting was random. He said someone must have followed them after dinner. Earlier that evening, the couple had eaten at an Italian restaurant nearby. Blake said he returned inside after dinner, claiming he forgot an item. He left Bonnie alone in the car. When he came back, she had been shot. The explanation appeared possible at first. The area was dark and the crime happened quickly. But investigators began examining the gaps in Blake's account. Bonnie Backley's life had been unstable long before her death. Friends described her as searching for security and recognition. She had been married multiple times and struggled financially. Her marriage to Blake was strained almost from the beginning. Witnesses reported frequent arguments and resentment. Blake reportedly complained about Bonnie to friends. He described her as a burden and a problem he could not escape. Investigators uncovered troubling background information. Witnesses came forward saying Blake had asked about hiring someone to kill Bonnie. Some described these comments as jokes. Others said they sounded serious. The statements raised red flags, even without physical proof. Police also examined Blake's movements that night. Witnesses placed him near the car longer than he admitted. His timeline shifted slightly with each retelling. The forensic picture was limited. There was no DNA tying Blake directly to the weapon. No fingerprints placed the gun in his hands. No surveillance footage captured the shooting. The murder weapon was never conclusively linked to him. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. That made the prosecution's task difficult from the start. In 2002, Robert Blake was charged with murder. The state argued the killing was planned rather than spontaneous. Prosecutors claimed Blake used distance and timing to create deniability. They argued he knew when Bonnie would be alone. They suggested he relied on his public status to deflect suspicion. The defense countered each claim aggressively. They attacked the credibility of witnesses. They emphasized the absence of forensic evidence. The trial became a study in reasonable doubt. Jurors heard conflicting accounts from former associates. Some witnesses admitted receiving benefits for their testimony. Others contradicted earlier statements. The defense framed the investigation as speculation layered on assumption. Without physical proof, they argued, suspicion was not enough. In March 2005, the jury reached its verdict. Robert Blake was found not guilty of murder. He walked out of criminal court a free man. The verdict underscored the limits of circumstantial cases. For Bonnie Backley's family, it felt like a door closing permanently. But the legal process was not finished. Bonnie's children filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit. The standard of proof was lower than in criminal court. The focus was narrower. In 2006, a civil jury found Blake liable for Bonnie's death. He was ordered to pay significant financial damages. The judgment financially devastated him. It did not send him to prison. 2 courtrooms delivered 2 different outcomes. One required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The other required responsibility by a preponderance of evidence. Bonnie Backley remained dead in both. Public perception of the case remained divided. Some believed Blake orchestrated the killing. Others believed the state failed to prove its theory. Blake maintained his innocence consistently. He never admitted involvement. He lived the rest of his life under suspicion rather than conviction. He died in 2023. Bonnie Backley is often remembered through controversy, her past relationships, her reputation, but none of that explains her death. She was unarmed. She was waiting in a car. She trusted her husband to return. This was not a crime solved by confession or science. It was shaped by absence, by distance, by doubt that could not be bridged. The case remains a reminder that legal outcomes and truth are not always aligned. Robert Blake avoided criminal punishment. Bonnie Backley never received an answer, and the space between those facts defines the case. Drew Peterson, on March 1, 2004, in Bolingbrook, Illinois. Kathleen Savio was found face down in the bathtub of her home. She was 40 years old, a mother of 2, and in the middle of a bitter divorce. Her husband, Drew Peterson, told police she had slipped, struck her head, and drowned. He was a veteran police officer, confident and familiar with procedure. Responding officers saw no immediate reason to challenge his explanation. The coroner ruled Kathleen's death an accident. The case was closed within days. But Kathleen had not felt safe. Friends and family later said she had expressed fear of Drew. Records indicated she documented injuries and spoke openly about threats. She told people that if anything happened to her, Drew should be investigated. Those warnings did not alter the initial conclusion. Kathleen was buried, and her concerns went with her. In the years that followed, Drew Peterson moved on quickly. He remarried, adding to a growing pattern of failed relationships. By the time Kathleen's divorce proceedings would have concluded, Drew was already living a new life. For a while, the past stayed buried. Then, in October 2007, his 4th wife disappeared. Stacy Peterson vanished from the same community. She left behind her car, purse, and children. There was no note and no evidence she intended to leave. Drew told police she had run off with another man. Few believed him. Media attention surged, and reporters began re-examining Kathleen Savio's death. 2 wives, 1 bathtub death, 1 unexplained disappearance. Public pressure forced authorities to take another look. Kathleen's family pushed relentlessly for a new investigation. They requested an exhumation and a second autopsy. In 2008, forensic experts reviewed the evidence again. Their conclusions changed everything. They identified blunt force trauma, cuts, and bruising inconsistent with a fall. Kathleen's death was reclassified as a homicide. Investigators widened their focus. They reviewed Drew's history, his statements, and his behavior after Kathleen's death. Witnesses reported hearing Drew make disturbing comments. Some described jokes about murder and references to knowing how to avoid prosecution. Secret recordings emerged, captured by a friend acting at the direction of authorities. In them, Drew spoke casually about killing and getting away with it. Prosecutors later argued those recordings revealed mindset, not bravado. The investigation faced a major obstacle. Stacy Peterson's body was never found. Without remains, her case stalled, but Kathleen's did not require a body anymore. Investigators focused on motive, tied to control, money, and divorce. Records indicated Kathleen's legal actions threatened Drew's finances and reputation. Witnesses confirmed she was preparing to testify against him. Prosecutors argued that gave him reason to act. Unlike many cases, digital evidence was limited. This investigation relied on testimony, recorded conversations, and forensic reassessment. The absence of a modern digital trail did not weaken the case. Instead, it highlighted how patterns and warnings can accumulate over time. Kathleen's fear became central rather than incidental. In 2012, Drew Peterson went to trial for Kathleen Savio's murder. The defense returned to the original explanation. They argued it was a tragic accident misinterpreted years later. They challenged the reliability of new forensic conclusions. The prosecution presented a broader picture. A woman trying to escape a dangerous marriage, a husband skilled in authority and procedure, and a death that fit neither chance nor coincidence. Jurors heard about Kathleen's warnings. They heard the recordings. They reviewed medical findings that contradicted a fall. They also considered Drew's conduct before and after the death. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty. Drew Peterson was sentenced to 38 years in prison. For Kathleen's family, the conviction validated what they had believed for years, but it did not close every wound. Stacy Peterson remains missing. Her case is unresolved. No remains, no trial, no sentence. From prison, Drew continued to give interviews. He mocked the process and maintained his innocence. The badge that once protected him no longer carried weight. But the consequences of delayed accountability remained. Kathleen Savio tried to warn people. She documented fear. She told friends. She spoke clearly. Her death was initially dismissed because the explanation was convenient. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was a crime shaped by confidence and authority. The case stands as a reminder that danger is not always hidden. Sometimes it is explained away, and sometimes the truth only emerges when another woman disappears. O.J. Simpson. In June 1994, a violent double homicide outside a Brentwood condominium drew police attention in Los Angeles. Shortly after midnight on June 13, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson was found dead outside her home. Nearby, the body of Ron Goldman was also discovered. Nicole was 35 years old, a mother of two, and recently divorced. Ron Goldman was 25 and had been returning items left behind at the residence. The scene showed signs of a sustained and personal attack. Emergency responders pronounced both victims dead at the scene. Police immediately began examining Nicole's background and recent history. Records indicated repeated domestic violence incidents involving her former husband, O.J. Simpson. There were documented 911 calls, police photographs, and prior interventions. Friends and family later said Nicole lived with persistent fear. She had attempted to create distance after the divorce. But separation did not bring safety. O.J. Simpson was already a public figure. He was a former football star, an actor, and a nationally recognized name. Investigators treated him as a person of interest early. Blood evidence was identified at the crime scene and along nearby pathways. Additional blood, consistent with Nicole's, was later found in Simpson's vehicle and home. Detectives also recovered a glove near the bodies and another near Simpson's residence. Footprints and timelines placed a suspect moving between locations within a narrow window. When police requested Simpson surrender for questioning, he did not appear. Instead, on June 17, 1994, the country watched a slow-speed pursuit. Simpson rode in the back of a white Ford Bronco as police followed. Television networks interrupted programming nationwide. The chase turned a homicide investigation into a cultural moment. By the time Simpson surrendered, the case was already under extraordinary pressure. The investigation continued as prosecutors prepared charges, forensic testing, linked Simpson's DNA to blood at the scene. The evidence appeared strong on paper. However, the defense strategy focused on how that evidence was collected. They questioned the chain of custody and potential contamination. They raised concerns about police conduct and racial bias. The case shifted from what happened to how the investigation was handled. The trial began in January 1995. It quickly became one of the most televised criminal trials in history. Courtroom arguments were dissected daily by commentators and analysts. The jury heard extensive testimony about DNA science. They also heard about police procedures and credibility. A key moment came when Simpson tried on gloves found at the scene. The defense argued the gloves did not fit, reinforcing reasonable doubt. The phrase became symbolic of the defense's case. Throughout the trial, Nicole's history of abuse received limited focus. Her documented fear became secondary to procedural debates. Ron Goldman's presence was often reduced to circumstance. The trial's center shifted away from the victims themselves. Instead, it revolved around institutions, trust, and doubt. On October 3, 1995, the jury delivered its verdict. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on all criminal charges. Reactions were immediate and sharply divided. Some celebrated the outcome, others believed justice had failed. The verdict exposed deep fractures in public trust and perception. The legal story did not end there. In 1996, the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman filed a civil lawsuit. The burden of proof was lower than in criminal court. The focus returned to responsibility rather than procedure. In 1997, a civil jury found Simpson liable for wrongful death. He was ordered to pay significant financial damages. No prison sentence followed. For Nicole's children, the outcome meant growing up with unanswered questions. Two verdicts existed side by side. One said their mother was killed. The other said no one was criminally guilty. The contrast became part of the legacy. Over time, the case came to represent larger themes: fame, race, power, institutional failure. But at its center remained two people who did not survive the night. Nicole Brown Simpson was not a symbol when she was alive. She was a woman trying to leave a dangerous relationship. Ron Goldman was not collateral. He was a young man in the wrong place at the wrong time. This case did not hinge on a lack of evidence. It hinged on how evidence was interpreted under extraordinary scrutiny. Lester Ralph Jones. In June 2007, a missing person report in Grand Junction, Colorado, marked the beginning of a case that would take years to unravel. On the evening of June 28, 2007, Paige Bergfeld failed to return home. She was 34 years old and the mother of 3 young children. Earlier that day, Paige had spent time with her first ex-husband, Howard Beigler. They separated in the early evening and spoke by phone afterward. Paige was last seen alive that night. When she did not come home, her 8-year-old daughter reported her missing. The report immediately raised concern. Officers found no sign that Paige had planned to disappear. Her home showed no evidence of a struggle. Her children's routines were left unfinished. Friends described Paige as organized and devoted. She maintained constant communication with her family. She did not vanish without explanation. Investigators quickly concluded she had not left voluntarily. 3 days later, a new development emerged. Paige's red Ford Focus was discovered burning in an empty parking lot near her home. The fire appeared intentional. Inside and around the vehicle, police found personal items. They also found business cards linked to a company called Models, Inc. That discovery changed the direction of the investigation. As detectives examined Paige's phone and computer, a hidden life surfaced. Paige had been operating an escort business under the alias Carrie. She kept this work secret from most of those close to her. Authorities believed she did so to support her children financially. The revelation expanded the suspect pool dramatically. Attention shifted from family members to clients. Investigators compiled a list of more than 60 potential suspects. They examined phone records, financial activity, and travel patterns. One name repeatedly stood out. Lester Ralph Jones, a married motorhome mechanic, had contacted Page shortly before her disappearance. When questioned, Jones denied knowing her. That denial collapsed when detectives confronted him with call logs. His past raised further concern. Jones had a history of domestic violence and attempted kidnapping. Despite strong suspicion, the case stalled. There was no body. There was no clear crime scene. Prosecutors believed Page had been kidnapped and killed, but belief alone was not enough to file charges. Years passed without resolution. Then, in March 2012, hikers made a grim discovery. Skeletal remains were found in a remote ravine along Highway 50. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Paige Bergfeld. Duct tape was found wrapped around her skull and jaw. The evidence strongly indicated kidnapping. Due to decomposition, the cause of death could not be determined, but investigators were certain a homicide had occurred. With Page's remains recovered, the case moved forward. In 2014, Lester Jones was formally charged. Prosecutors alleged he abducted Page, murdered her, and disposed of her body. They argued he later returned and set her car on fire to destroy evidence. The first trial ended in a mistrial after the jury failed to agree. The case returned to court a second time. In December 2016, the jury reached a verdict. Lester Jones was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no further questions of responsibility. Paige Bergfeld was remembered as a devoted mother who lived a divided life. One side, visible and ordinary, the other hidden and dangerous. Her case highlighted how secrecy can create vulnerability. It also showed how justice can be delayed without physical proof. For years, evidence pointed in one direction. The law required patience. This story is not about mystery. It is about exposure, about the cost of living unseen. Paige Bergfeld did not disappear by choice. She was taken, and years later, the truth finally surfaced.